A note to listeners, the following podcast contains content that may not be suitable for all audiences.
Of course, the last 6 years I have been working with one serial killer in particular, extracting confessions out of him with a partner who unfortunately recently passed away a year ago. But my expertise essentially in serial perpetrators has brought me to at least extract 9 cold case confessions out of this individual, Richard Cottingham, the torso killer.
I had followed his work and I had reached out to him, and we just both were going into Trenton State Prison. He was going to see his serial killer. I was going in to see one of mine out of Trenton State. So we went in together and we actually sat next to each other, and I got to see him in action, interviewing and extracting.
I had this interesting experience of meeting this serial killer kind of in the wild. He wasn't apprehended. It wasn't like I was interviewing him, but I had this encounter with a serial killer out there without realizing I was having that encounter.
You are listening to Partners in True Crime. We are your hosts, Rob and Cindy Dorfman. Hi, everyone. If you're enjoying the podcast, please leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts, even if it's one word.
And please subscribe to our website, www.partnersintruecrime. Follow us on TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram to check out our weekly promos. We're also now on YouTube at Partners in True Crime. If you subscribe to our website, you'll be getting weekly emails from us and all kinds of promotions and things that we don't advertise on the podcast.
The work that Laura Brand does with serial killers is a solitary occupation. Most of the time, it's just Laura sitting in the cage alone with the world's worst human beings. Let's be honest, there's not a whole lot of people who are doing this type of work, but there are others, and Laura does run into them occasionally.
Peter VRONSKI is a Canadian author, filmmaker, and forensic historian. He holds a PhD in criminal justice, history, and espionage. But what is unique about him, like Laura, is that he has been talking to the torso killer, Richard Cottingham, to extract information about his missing victims.
Laura bumped into Peter inside Trenton State Prison in New Jersey when she was there to interview a killer, and Peter was there to talk to Cottingham. They have become allies in a twisted world trying to do right by the victims' families.
Today is part one of our two-part interview with Dr. Peter VRONSKI, who, by his own admission, never thought he'd ever be meeting a serial killer, let alone talking to them. So let's hear what he has to say.
So we're very happy to have on the podcast Dr. Peter VRONSKI. He's a forensic historian. Am I correct?
That's right.
Great.
And an author of many books.
And author. I keep forgetting that part.
Yeah, his book, Sons of Cain, is fantastic. I just finished it. It's very good.
That's great. And so we wanted to have Peter on because he's actually met Laura, and we'll have them talk about that story. And he has he's written a lot about serial killers, not just here in the U.S., but all over the world. And he's based out of Canada, where he teaches. And I want him to tell us all a little bit about his background and what he does, and then we'll dive in with a bunch of questions. Go ahead, Peter.
Well, like you introduced me, I am a forensic historian. I don't consider myself an expert on serial killers. My expertise essentially is in their history. Where do they come from? How do they become what they become? And how we used to investigate them in the past and in the present. My PhD actually is in a whole different kind of serial crime. I'm a specialist in the history of espionage. And of course, spies, they're serial perpetrators as well. And so spies and serial killers, they often have very similar kind of psychopathologies. And when I talk about spies, I mean people who betray their own country. I'm not talking about, intelligence officers and so forth. So there is a kind of similarity, and of course, the last 6 years, I have been working with one serial killer in particular, extracting confessions out of him with a partner who unfortunately recently passed away a year ago. But my expertise essentially in serial perpetrators has brought me to at least extract 9 cold case confessions out of this individual, Richard Cottingham, the torso killer.
Which
So
is why
that's essentially my background.
Which is why we wanted to have Dr. VRONSKI on today with Laura, because he is doing similar work to what Laura's been doing for the past decade. And not many people know about the torso killer. So after we have Laura kind of mention how you guys met and what she thought of what your work has been compared to what she's been doing, I would love for you to kind of dive into that case with us so we can let people know what that's all about. So Laura, how did you meet Dr. VRONSKI?
I had followed his work and I had reached out to him, and we just both were going into Trenton State Prison. He was going to see his serial killer. I was going in to see one of mine out of Trenton State. So we went in together and we actually sat next to each other, and I got to see him in action, interviewing and extracting.
When was this?
I think it was,
It was definitely before COVID. I know that.
I was going to say pre-COVID, yeah.
2019 probably.
Yeah.
In fact, I talked to him this afternoon. He remembers you, Laura. And I just was telling him about what you were doing, and he remembered that day, because that was a strange thing for somebody to suddenly, the both of us talking to each other was like, who the hell are these people? Where are they from? It was totally unexpected. They kind of seek you, so it's at random that we ended up sitting next to each other.
Yeah.
Visiting who were visiting. So.
Laura, who were you visiting?
I think it was Reldon, Robert Reldon. I have a couple out of there. Charles Cullen, Robert Reldon. I have a few spree killers out of Trenton State.
Was that the first time you met someone who was doing the work like you were doing, Laura?
Yes. Yeah, that was my first time going into a prison, getting to meet somebody, doing the same work that I was doing, and, actually get to see them in action and actually sit next to each other.
Wow. Well,
yeah.
Peter, tell us a little bit about your serial killer, Cottingham, because just so people know. I mean, most people know who he is, but just for our audience, just give us a little background on him.
And tell us the story of how you first encountered him, because that's a fascinating story that was in your book.
Yeah, it's a long story. I've told it so many times. It's hard to tell now. It's becoming almost like a script I do, because everybody asks, right?
Well, because it's so great. It's
fantastic.
A great story.
I know. It's of course. I ran into. Well, let me tell you about the serial killer himself. Richard Cottingham, the torso killer, is notorious because in 1979, in December, he murdered 2 women in a near Times Square, a 42nd Street hotel. Actually, it was in Hell's Kitchen, 10th Avenue and 42nd Street. But he murders 2 sex workers inside his hotel room. He cuts their heads off and their hands. He puts them in a valise. Then he sets the torsos on fire, and he leaves with the heads and the hands. And I'm checking into that hotel at that moment, trying to get a room. It's Sunday morning around 9 o'clock. And so as he's fleeing the scene, I end up encountering him in the lobby in the elevator as he's getting off. And of course, I remembered him because he annoyed me. He held up the elevator. I'm there waiting, I'm pushing the button. And when you push that elevator button 50 times, somehow the elevator doesn't come down any faster, right? And so I'm now really getting impatient. And who's the jerk off who's holding up the elevator? And so he comes down, and I give him a hard look, right? And so I gotta, if somebody asked me to describe him after, there are things I don't remember. I don't remember if he had a mustache or not. I'd be a terrible eyewitness, but I did get a look at him, and I remember a number of things, like, he was sweaty, his eyes kind of like a little bit out of it. He kind of looked through me almost as if I wasn't there, and actually walked through me, bumping me with a bag. I didn't know what was in it, but it felt like bowling balls, and I'm assuming those were the heads. We kind of argued because he's telling me that he took those heads out earlier. That what he probably hit me with was the curve of the hacksaw that he used to take the heads off. But he says he already had him in the trunk of the car. So I don't know. There's a lot of things I still don't know. Because kind of the fire department, fire marshal has a different timeline than the one he gives me. In any regards, I didn't know it was a serial killer. I didn't know what happened upstairs. I figure I get on the elevator. I figure, yeah, I'll go up to his floor. See, I hadn't checked in yet. I wasn't sure I was going to when I arrived there. It's 9 a.m. They tell me rooms aren't ready yet, but we'll have rooms towards 10:30. I don't know if I want to stay in this place. So New York, as you said, it's a bad time in New York, 79. I've never been to this place. So I figured I'll take a walk around first, and then I'll decide if I'll stay there. So I hit his floor. I go up to his floor, and as soon as I come off the elevator, there's this smell. All right, like I can smell. It's like something burning, like chicken feathers or the hair. Like if you ever burned your mustache, that smell of burning hair. And I figured that's the way the hotel smells, right? So I walked around maybe for 2-3 minutes, and then I come around the curve, and of course now I see smoke, and there's people are knocking on the doors and evacuating that floor. So I just hit the fire stairs and go out in the street. Fire department is arriving. I say bye-bye. I'm not staying here. Forget this, right? And I stay somewhere else. No idea what happened. Next morning, I arrive. I had an appointment. I had to be somewhere. I arrive in the waiting room there, and I look at the newspapers, and it's like 2 torsos found burning, sex workers. Papers at that time described them as hookers, right, from Times Square. And I'm going, holy, that's where I was in last night, right, last morning. I don't think of him at all, because you got to remember, 79, the word serial killer is still not being used. John Douglas, Robert Ressler, the mine hunters, they're just starting doing those interviews, right? So we don't have profiling, the system that the FBI is going to come up with, the organized, disorganized dichotomy. None of that exists. Ressler, Douglas hadn't written their book yet, Sexual Homicide, Patterns and Motives. So I had no memory of the guy on the elevator, because of course now we have this concept. We hear the word serial killer and we think, oh, the quiet neighbor next door, my husband, the school teacher, or the guy you bump into on the elevator. None of that was in my mind. What I did remember, however, was his haircut. He had this kind of almost like a page boy haircut. And of course, my story when I come back to Canada my memory begins my getting off the elevator and smelling the smoke. So at cocktail parties, that's the story I'm telling. About a year and a half later, I'm back in New York, and I see in the papers that they actually arrested the guy. I see the picture of him in the papers, right? He's on trial now. I recognize the goddamn haircut. I suddenly go, damn, So I'm curious, like, who the hell are these guys? Because we have serial killers, the Boston Strangler, Jack the Ripper, Ed Gein, Psycho. We just didn't call them that. So the first thing I read, of course, is we have our seminal postmodern serial killer, Ted Bundy. So I get Ann Rule's book, Stranger Beside Me. That's the first time I started reading about a serial killer. And guess what? in Ann Rule's book, the word serial killer does not appear either, right?
No.
In Stranger
Mhm.
Beside Me. The book comes out 1980 or 81, somewhere early 81. We're still not using that word. It appears, first time I tracked it down where it's kind of deliberately used is in the New York Times, May 1981. New York Times describes describes Wayne Williams, the Atlanta child killer, as a serial murderer, and they start using that construct. Right now, Robert Resler coined the word inside the police community, inside the coming profilers. They're looking for a word, but as far as the public is concerned, the media, that word doesn't exist, and the concept didn't exist either. Sexual homicide, the manual, essentially comes out in '86. And then, I think 91, 92, Silence of the Lambs comes out, and suddenly,
Suddenly, yeah.
everybody knows about behavioral sciences, the FBI interviewing serial killers. We all understand. You hear the word serial killer, you're looking at your neighbor now, and all those concepts start getting ingrained in our mythology, in our history, in our culture, and that's where it comes from. So I had this interesting experience of meeting this serial killer kind of in the wild. He wasn't apprehended. It wasn't like I was interviewing him, but I had this encounter with a serial killer out there without realizing I was having that encounter.
But he wasn't the
so that
only
inspired my book, essentially.
right, and then he wasn't the only serial killer that you encountered in the wild.
Oh yeah. As I was writing my first book,
In the wild.
I realized I had stumbled into another serial killer in Russia in 1990 when I was working on the documentary, and I turned him down for an interview. So that I remember him because of the story he told, he was in. This was Chikatilo, of course the Red Ripper, and he was in Moscow protesting something, and we were shooting the protesters, and so he kind of caught my attention because he had an old Russian flag that you didn't see at that time, that early yet, stuck. He had like a little tent, and so he had this little Russian flag. So he caught my attention, and we started talking to him, and he starts telling me the story about how he's there to meet Gorbachev, the premier of Russia at that time, and of course, what the story he had to do with the mafia building a toilet next to his apartment house, right?
Something totally crazy.
There were people there who were like in the labor camps. They lost their families. They had heavy stories to tell. This guy's story, I'm thinking, man, this guy's a screwball. Forget this. So we kind of passed on the story, and I didn't realize it was him until I read in the records as I'm writing my book that he was suspected of killing someone in Moscow, and that he was in Moscow protesting about a toilet being built right outside the windows of his apartment. So I knew it was him. Wow. But I was just kicking myself. Not that he wanted to be interviewed about being a serial killer,
right?
But still, I would have had him,
right,
again in the wild. Because 3 weeks later, after I turned him down for the interview, not because I turned him down, but after I turned him down for the interview, he's arrested for his 51st, 52nd, 53rd murder.
53 murders, the Red Ripper. People don't really know that much about him in the U.S. I only know a lot more because I lived in Europe and I was in Moscow quite a bit. But he was like a mythological figure, this Red Ripper guy. Like they didn't know where he came from. He was so terrifying. He killed like 50.
And I was watching him because his trial was televised, and I was working in Russia, and I was watching him on TV without realizing that's the guy. right? Because his head was shaved and he was all, by the time they had him in that cage, he was like, he was behaving crazy. I mean,
Yeah.
all that stuff he was doing. So I didn't recognize him at all. But I remembered him. I remembered him because he was one of the things in the protest. He was wearing a tie, right? Like who in the tent city has a tie, right? And the other thing I remember is he had these big glasses, and as he was talking, he was getting excited, and his glasses were steaming up. So you know, I remember like the tie bobbing, and I remember the glasses steaming up, but otherwise I didn't remember anything about him. Just those two things. And if it wasn't for how kooky and stupid his story was, I of course would not have recognized him at all.
Yeah, that's crazy.
It's crazy.
Incredible. I know.
It's interesting how some people will meet one person like that, but you met two, you know, that were out before they're doing it. And it's just weird. Does that, and what is that? How did you transition to that, to where your interest into these serial killers? Did that kind of...
You know, I had the question in a way like, is there something wrong with me? You know, am I traveling in a bad way? I know that I was certainly I was trespassing in Richard Cottingham's territory by checking into that hotel. So okay, I'll buy that. You know, Chikatilo I met in the public square. But listen, at
some
random,
people...
Say again?
I met Robert Kennedy a year before he was assassinated. I was a kid. I ran into him in Montreal with my dad, right? I ran into Sammy Davis Jr. in the cigar store in London. I ran into Peter O'Toole on an elevator. I ran into Elton John coming out of a hair clinic in Toronto. I ran into Andy Warhol in New York. So, you know, what can I say?
You're
I wasn't seeking these people out. You know, they weren't serial killers as far as I know. So, and that's just, there's about 5 other people. Tiny Tim, I ran into in the lobby of where he lived, because the Hotel Alcott, because you could rent rooms there, just totally at random. And so I can name about 10 people that I had run into at random that way. I really didn't travel, you know, more than, you know, I traveled a little bit more than the average person, but it wasn't like I was a crazy traveler on the road every day. So we probably run into, all of us, I imagine, and I think I wrote that in my book. I said, you know, essentially, probably all of us have walked by a serial killer, or sat on the bus next to one, or parked our car next to one. There are enough of them out there. We just don't know it. The only difference is that I found out who my serial killers were, but who knows who you guys, you know, might have.
Yeah,
you know,
I think,
you know, got on the subway next to.
Exactly. But I think there are certain people, because I think we're all kind of like that on this call here, that are kind of antennas. Because I found myself at different points where history and people have kind of revealed itself when I was unaware of it, you know? So it's like, I think you have that, when you have that, I don't know what it is, but I think it's just part of our genetic makeup or DNA or anything like that. Because I don't know a lot of people like us that kind of are drawn to these subjects because we're exposed to them. You know, I was exposed to this because I was a young producer, and they were doing these prison documentaries, and then they had the producer, he couldn't do the show to go to this prison, and they said last minute they sent me, and I had no idea where I was going. I was going to Corcoran State Prison, had no idea what it was about. Spent 10 days there, find out that, you know, I met Sirhan there. I interviewed Charles Manson, all these, and I had no idea. And it was just kind of completely random. And then, like, I came back from that, and then the war, 9/11 happened, and I was on the prison yard in Folsom interviewing someone. I get a call, and they said, "Do you have a passport that's ready to go?" I go. They shut me on a plane, and I went to the Middle East. And so I was part of the Enduring Freedom. So I think there's times where you're not even thinking about it, but if for some reason certain people get grabbed by those moments and have opportunities, and I think that's what happened to you, happened to me. It's happened to Cindy.
Many
It's
times.
happened to Laura.
Yeah.
I mean, the randomness of, Lawrence Bittaker answering her letters and allowing her to come here. And then as soon as she goes and sees him, he opens up to her and starts spilling all these details. I mean, there's something in our makeup that allows that to happen. It doesn't happen to everybody. And I think we all kind of experience that because, people, we tell people these stories, like we're fascinated with that story, but we totally relate to it.
Yeah. Because it
Totally
happens
relate
to
to
us.
it. But, I tell my, my family to this day has no idea what I do.
No, they don't.
And they could care less. And I don't even bother telling them anymore. And then they'll watch it and they go, you were there? You talked to him? I spent like a month talking to Gary Ridgway on the phone, because his niece worked for me and I had no idea she was related to him. And then the last day at work, she came in to thank me. And I asked her, I go, what are you going to do now? And she goes, well, I was thinking about doing a documentary about my family. I go, what's unique about your family? He goes, well, my uncle's Gary Ridgway. And I was like, whoa, sit down. And 2 years later, we're doing this documentary where, because she was a new mother and she wanted to find out more about her family history. She was so worried about the genetic serial killer gene getting passed on to her kids. So she wanted to learn all this stuff. And so we opened up this whole Pandora's box where we have to talk to him. No one's talked to him. My whole family has been separated. I want to bring him back together. And so that was an opportunity to do that and find more information about and, get victims and stuff like that and get details. So I think there's a universe that we're swimming around in that a lot of people aren't swimming around in.
Yeah. Certainly, I find myself being pulled into different orbits. I mean, just from the daughter of one of the torso victims calling me in 2017 and introducing herself to me and essentially saying, I'm talking with Richard Cottingham, help me, and I'll get you in to see him. He'll talk to you because otherwise, he wasn't talking to anybody.
Yeah.
And so, but he was talking to her. And so how could I say no? All right. In fact, I was finishing Sons of Cain. That was going to be my last book on serial killers. I wasn't going to do another 6 years of this. I was going to start writing about other things. But then Jennifer Weiss, daughter of Judea Gudarzi, calls me out of the blue, right? And now, 6 years later, I've got hundreds of hours in with Cottingham. I met Laura. I living an unexpected life. All those years when I actually met these serial killers, and even I didn't write about them until 2004. So that's now 20 years ago. But the last 6 years, I've actually been, actually talking to them. None of my books, I interviewed any serial killers. I didn't want to. I looked at YouTube and all the questions that people ask those serial killers that are on YouTube and are on the TV shows are the same questions I would have asked. There's nothing that I wanted to ask that nobody else didn't. And the answers they gave were totally unsatisfactory. So I didn't want to talk to any. And so Richard Cottingham is the first, because everybody assumed that I was doing all these interviews with them. Richard Cottingham is the first and only serial killer I've been, talking to. And really, it started as interviews, but he started blurting out confessions. That's how it all started, right? Yeah. He started blurting out all these confessions because when I arrived with Jennifer, he was in for only 6 murders. He's in now for 18.
Wow.
And so that's over the last 6 years. And 9 of them, Jennifer and I directly assisted in those 9 being closed. And so just the idea that I would be involved in an actual investigation, not just writing about the history of it, not just witnessing it, but actually participating in it and contributing and assisting in it was something I never imagined. So you're kind of right. We do get propelled into, I don't know if there are opportunities. I'd almost dread using that word opportunity, right? But you know, they are opportunities to to do something.
Well, there's
And that's what it was.
circumstances. Yeah,
I'm
there's
actually,
circumstances that.
closing cases. I never imagined at the end of my life, like I'm in my mid-60s. I'm supposed to be going on the beach somewhere, retiring in coconuts and sunshine, not doing this. So this was unexpected.
Yeah.
So when Jennifer, she was one of the daughters of one of the victims of the torso killer. When
Yes,
she
yeah.
reached out to you, she just found you on the internet, or how did she find you? And what happened when?
She reached out? Well, she read my books, because of course I describe Cottingham in the books, right? So either she found me on the internet or somebody gave her my number, but she introduced herself as Dita Godarzi's daughter. I knew she existed because Dita Godarzi gave her up for adoption about 18 months prior to her murder. And I always wondered what happened to the infant, because you see, the way they identified the torso, because remember, she had no hands, no heads. And so it was the cesarean birth scar that helped them narrow down who's missing. And her shoes. Cottingham made a big mistake. He left her shoes in the room. And her shoes were only sold in a few Bamberger stores in Trenton, New Jersey. So the cops had a torso, no head, no hands, but they had shoes only sold in Bambergers, and they have a cesarean scar. So she had kids. So they start going through hospital records. They're looking for witnesses, anybody missing, and in about a month, they identified the first torso. Second one was never identified to this day. A teenage girl, we don't know who she is.
Wow.
So Jennifer wanted to find the heads. And we've been searching for the heads. We've done now multiple searches because, of course, if we can find Dita's head, we're going to find the other girl. And now with facial reconstruction, she also had a very rare blood type. We still might have a chance at identifying her. But we just got to find those two severed heads, and the valise. It's a vinyl valise. The vinyl is not biodegradable, but of course that presents problems as well. And searching out for human remains that are 40 years old, you need a special kind of dog. It's not an ordinary cadaver dog. You need war grave dogs.
Yep.
Yeah,
Dogs
we
that
have
are
them.
sniffing out missing soldiers in Guadalcanal from in the Pacific, right? And New York. It's a New York case because she's missing essentially on the New York case. And I got to say, NYPD was amazing how they responded to searching for this girl, because they don't need the heads. Cottingham was convicted back in 1984. He's serving time for those murders, so nobody needs those heads to prosecute him. He's convicted on that. But because this girl was still missing, NYPD put in, and are still putting in, a lot of energy. I mean, cops are coming out on their own time now looking for this last girl.
Yeah.
So
the
tried
police.
She's buried. We have her torso. You see, certainly for DNA, we can extract the DNA from her torso, except her torso is buried on Hart Island, which is the potter's grave. Over 1 million New Yorkers buried on this island offshore in the Bronx. And geological shifts have moved the graves, so they cannot, what they wanted to do, of course, was just to tap in from the surface. But now they can't determine for sure where exactly her body is without digging up the entire row, because all the people are buried in a row there. So that's a problem. And little technical things, bureaucratic things have made what was going to be an 18-month thing into 6 years.
Yeah. The valise. So did he tell you where he dumped the valise?
Yes, he told us, yeah. Yeah,
Where did he dump it?
we got it. We've identified the area. It's about a 20 square yard, 20 square foot area that we've been working now. 3-4 times we've now searched on it. It's on a slope, so maybe animals dug it up the day after. We're talking about 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of stuff has come down from the slope, so it's hard to say how deep it is. What we haven't done yet is we haven't brought in, ground penetrating radar. That's the next step. But we've done the dogs, we've done the metal detectors in the hope that maybe the metal clasps from the valise. He also tells us that he thinks he threw the handcuffs into the valise as well. So that would give us certainly enough metal to give a nice strong signal for the metal detector. But we're not here. There's a lot of people have been there. People have picnicked there for 120 years in that location. We're hitting pop cans and beer cans and wine bottles from the 1890s. Right? It's a trail that's a natural trail that people have been using, like I said, for over 100 years.
Wow.
So we know where it is, and we just haven't. The first dig, we kind of missed it. They brought in a lot of equipment. They were there 2 days excavating it. Nothing. And every time I think he might be telling us a story, he gives up a detail that makes me confirm it. Little things that are I always have doubts, right? He's a serial killer. That's what they do, right? They tell you stories, but every time I get to that doubt point, he gives me something, and I go back to that place and I confirm it.
When you first met him, what was that experience like?
We were both very shy. That's what I would describe him. I met him first time I came in with Jennifer. So Jennifer introduced us. And he had a lot of business questions for me. He is he was very protective of Jennifer. And he wanted to make sure that she was getting into a good deal, that I was a genuine writer. He wanted to know who my publisher was, how many books I sold, did I have an agent. He asked all the right questions. And then my first question to him, of course, was, "Do you remember me?" And he had no memory of me whatsoever. He was a little shocked, in fact, that I had run into him. He got it was as if he got worried all of a sudden. He was like, "Did the police interview you?" Right? And I explained to him that I never went to the police. And I wouldn't have even thought of going to the police. I didn't know it was a serial killer that I met. But he has got memory issues, major memory issues. And so that night, he's got different versions and timelines. And I've got forensic timelines from the ME's office, from the fire marshal's office, from a couple of witnesses that line up with my memory, but don't line up with his memory. And yet, objectively, things that he's telling me, like, he described the river the morning he was there. And he tells me that he was already burying those heads about an hour and a half before I felt that he bumped me in the legs with them, right? So am I wrong, or and I have a grouping of factual things that back his story up, and a grouping of factual things that back my story up, and who knows how it's going to get resolved now. Certainly until I find the heads, I'm wondering, because my thought was, but why, the heads are in a very elaborate place. right? And why bury them there? Why not just toss them in the dumpster? Take a drive uptown and toss them in the dumpster. And I got theories for what, why he may not want to say that to Jennifer at that time. I threw your mom's head in the dumpster. I know that when he described where the heads were, nobody thought that the NYPD would go mount a search for them. Certainly he didn't. And for me, it was like a fantasy. Oh, yeah, NYPD is going to go running looking for the heads, Yeah, sure. Right. So that I managed to get them to do it. Came, they did it within 3 months of my kind of raising the alarm. And they didn't tell me until the day of, because they didn't want me showing up there. All right. So I was told the morning they were doing it, I was told not to come to the scene, neither Jennifer nor I. But that we could go sit down with Cottingham at the Bergen County office, because this was on the New Jersey side. That was the other thing that was complicating it, because you had multiple agencies involved, right? So we were invited to come down and sit with Cottingham once he's brought back from that scene. And when I saw Cottingham that day, his eyes were like, they're looking for the heads. When he told us where those heads were, I think he thought the same thing we did. Nobody's going to go looking for them. Forget about it. Right? But they did. And they're looking. And they're still looking. And it's amazing.
It is amazing.
That's
I wish Jennifer was around for the end of it, because she never got a chance to come out to the latest searches. By then she was sick. And so, that's the sad part.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to ask Laura. I mean, this is kind of so similar to what you've been doing. It's that race against time, because you've dealt with a lot of victims' families who have passed on, who you've talked to, and have doing all this amazing work that you're doing, extracting information. I mean, when you first met Peter, what was it? Because that was it was like 6 years ago. How long ago? Was it 6 years ago?
2019, I want to say. We think, yeah.
18, 19.
How did it feel to meet someone who was doing pretty much the same thing you were doing? And then it's like, how do you compare notes? I mean, since then you've met other people like, Rob Dick, who's doing that. He's a private investigator, bounty hunter, but it's such a unique situation where you're going in and you're basically opening yourself up to this basically horrific person who's done horrific things. And you have to, like we always say, tactical empathy to kind of extract information from them. I mean, it must be interesting when you meet people like Peter who are doing the same thing and also are getting results based upon that work. I mean, he's like he said before, all these other convictions he's gotten, he's in there. Like, it's just, and that's the end goal. Obviously, the end goal is to bring those people back so the families have resolution. But how does that, how do you respond to that?
It's been really great because it's been a support system. I mean, I've always messaged Peter, he's messaged me, and it's kind of like he'll be doing the searches in New York and I'll see it on Facebook, and then I'll be, in the San Gabriel Mountains posting like up in the mountains, and it's kind of like we're doing exactly the same thing at the same point in time. Like when he got his extractions was when I got my extractions. So it's like almost identical timeline too. And we're, it's been great having somebody who I can just go to and soundboard, because nobody else is having these experiences. Like who else is, dedicating their life to find these missing victims and sit with the serial killer like every weekend? Nobody. So it's been great having Peter to go to, and Jennifer too. It's been great to have a support system like that.
Please visit our website where you can subscribe to the podcast, find show notes, and check out extra content from all of our podcasts. All rights reserved. This has been a production of 722 Media Content.